Body Knows, episode 18, Breaking Trauma Loops. Welcome back to The Body Knows. In the last episode, we traced the ways stress can become a permanent backdrop, how it reshapes not only the nervous system, but time itself, narrowing what we can feel and imagine. Today, we step into one of the most stubborn patterns that grows out of that constant pressure. Trauma loops. Trauma loops aren't just habits or quirks. They're full-body states that repeat themselves again and again, often without our consent. They are the nervous system's replay button stuck on survival. When most people hear the word trauma, they picture a single event, the accident, the betrayal, the violence. But trauma is not the event itself, it is the body's encoding of it. It's what happens when the nervous system is overwhelmed, unable to complete its stress cycle, and then forced to carry that unfinished energy forward. Trauma doesn't just linger in memory, it loops. And when it loops, the past doesn't stay in the past. That's why years can pass, and yet one smell, one glance, one sudden tone of voice can collapse decades in an instant. Suddenly, then, is indistinguishable from now. To ground this, I want you to imagine walking into a crowded space, a concert, a supermarket on a Saturday, or a busy street. At first, you're fine, but then something shifts. The noise grows sharper, the press of bodies feels suffocating, your chest tightens, your heart races. Rationally, you know you're safe, but your body insists danger, panic rises. You're fighting the urge to run. That's a trauma loop in action. The body has mistaken present cues for past threat. It isn't weakness or overreaction. It's neurobiology. The amygdala firing alarms, the hippocampus collapsing time, the vagus nerve shifting out of calm and into survival. Over this episode, we'll map these loops from several angles. First, how trauma interrupts the body's natural arc of stress and forces it into repetition. Then, repetition is not only psychological but physiological, structural, and even genetic. We'll explore how loops echo across generations through epigenetics and cultural inheritance. We'll also look at the subtler reinforcements, the chemical loops built into modern life, because cult leaders aren't the only ones who hand out spiked drinks to weaken resistance. Our culture has its own Kool-Aid, from aspartame sweetened soft drinks to everyday substances that dull awareness, confuse signals, and keep nervous systems hooked. And finally, I'll share reflections from my own journey, where I've seen loops play out in conflict, in silence, in patterns I once mistook for choice. We'll explore not only how loops imprison us, but how awareness can begin to loosen their grip. Because if the body can learn to repeat what hurts, it can also learn to rewire. Loops are not destiny. They are unfinished survival scripts. And today, we begin naming them, mapping them, and breaking them. Naming the loop. When we use the phrase trauma loop, it can sound abstract, almost clinical. But in reality, loops are lived experiences. They are the everyday, visceral ways our nervous systems replay the past in the present. To name the loop is to shine light on the process that often happens in the shadows, the sudden surge of panic, the tightening of muscles, the tunnel vision, the overwhelming urge to fight, flee, or shut down. Imagine again the supermarket scenario. You enter casually, perhaps even enjoying the bustle at first. But gradually something changes. The air feels thicker, the chatter around you sharper, the fluorescent lighting harsher on your eyes. Your chest tightens as though someone has wrapped a band around it. Breathing becomes shallow. You feel a wave of heat flush through your body, your palms begin to sweat, and you're aware of your heart pounding. Nothing bad is happening in the room, yet your body is screaming, not safe. This is the anatomy of a loop. The body isn't responding to what's objectively in front of it, groceries, shoppers, and shelves. It's responding to associations built years earlier, when perhaps being trapped, overwhelmed, or unheard marked danger. The noise of the crowd becomes a metaphor for childhood shouting. The press of bodies echoes memories of being cornered. The harsh lighting reminds you of classrooms or hospital visits. The body doesn't need exact replicas. Similarity is enough. The first thing to recognize is that trauma loops bypass conscious choice. By the time you notice panic rising, your nervous system has already moved. The amygdala, the brain's smoke alarm, detects cues it links with past danger and hits the alarm before the prefrontal cortex, the rational mind, even gets a say. Cortisol and adrenaline flood your system. The vagus nerve, which normally anchors social engagement and calm, pulls you into survival mode. Muscles tense, eyes widen, digestion halts, blood rushes to limbs. All of this unfolds in milliseconds. You don't decide to panic. You don't choose the surge of heat or the knot in your stomach. These are automatic evolutionary responses. From the body's point of view, the past is here again, and survival is priority one. Loops in everyday life. Loops don't only show up in crowds. They manifest in countless small ways. Consider a workplace meeting. A colleague dismisses your idea with a smirk. Your stomach drops, heat rises to your face, and suddenly you're struggling to find words. Outwardly, it looks like shyness or insecurity. Inwardly, your body is replaying old scripts, maybe the childhood classroom where teachers mock mistakes, or a family dynamic where speaking up was punished. The present dismissal becomes a portal to past silencing. Or think of a family dinner. Someone makes a cutting joke at your expense. Laughter erupts around the table, but your body freezes. You smile weakly, but inside your chest tightens and your throat constricts. The room blurs. Rationally, you know it's just a joke, but your nervous system says otherwise. It remembers being ridiculed when you were too small to defend yourself. The body loops back, shutting down in the face of what feels like danger. I've known these loops myself. In conversations where I felt dismissed, I'd feel the familiar surge, heat rising, breath constricting, thoughts racing. It wasn't logical in the moment, but it was deeply familiar. My nervous system wasn't reacting to the person in front of me so much as to echoes of the past. Each present conflict became layered with the weight of old ones, breaking the illusion of choice. What makes trauma loops cruel is the way they masquerade as choice. From the outside, it looks like you chose to snap, chose to leave the room, chose to freeze. But inside, the loop was already in motion before conscious thought arrived. The body acted, and the mind caught up later. This creates a painful dissonance. You tell yourself, next time I'll do better, but when the next time comes, the loop fires again. This is why willpower alone doesn't work. You can't shame or discipline yourself out of a loop. Loops aren't moral failings, they are physiological scripts. They require awareness, not punishment. Awareness slows the automaticity. When you learn to map your own loop, the tight chest, the racing thoughts, the flushed skin, you create a pause. Even a half second of recognition is space enough to begin choosing differently. Loops as metaphor, returning to the supermarket example, the panic isn't about groceries. It's about the body remembering being trapped, unheard, or overwhelmed. The crowd becomes a stand in for past helplessness. Trauma loops turn the present into metaphor. That's why they're so destabilizing. The body is not only saying, I feel unsafe, but also whispering, this moment is like that old one. When reality itself feels unreliable, when the present morphs into the past, it becomes difficult to trust your own perception. This is one of the most corrosive effects of trauma loops. They erode confidence in your senses. You begin to doubt not just your environment, but yourself. The loop is an unfinished story. The key insight here is that loops are unfinished stories. The body is trying again and again to complete what it never could, to fight back, to flee successfully, to be heard, to be comforted. Each activation is the body's attempt at resolution. But because the present situation rarely allows that completion, you can't scream in the supermarket, can't flee every meeting. The loop recycles instead. This is why naming the loop is so powerful. It changes the story. Instead of I'm broken, it becomes my body is repeating. Instead of I can't handle life, it becomes this is survival energy seeking completion. Naming doesn't fix everything, but it punctures the shame. And without shame, healing has room to begin. Reflection. So here's the reflection for this part. Where in your life do you notice the same body response repeating, no matter the context? Is there a place where panic, shutdown, or anger rises faster than seems logical? If so, that's likely a trauma loop. The body isn't betraying you, it's repeating what it knows. Awareness, naming the loop without judgment, is the first act of compassion. Why trauma doesn't complete itself. When we talk about trauma, it's easy to focus on the event, the accident, the betrayal, the humiliation, the violence. But trauma is not the event itself. Trauma is the way the nervous system encodes the event when it cannot complete its natural arc of survival. It is the interruption that defines trauma. It is being stopped, silenced, frozen, and forced to carry unfinished survival energy forward into the future. The natural arc of survival, let's begin with what is supposed to happen. In animals, the sequence is simple and observable. A gazelle chased by a lion runs at full speed. Its body mobilizes everything for survival. Heart racing, blood pumping to the legs, adrenaline flooding. If it escapes, the gazelle doesn't simply go back to grazing as if nothing happened. First, it trembles. It shakes violently, its legs quivering, its breath heaving. Sometimes it collapses, convulses, and only then rises to stand. Ethologists like Peter Levine and Stephen Porges have studied this process. The shaking is not pathological. It is a resolution. It is the body discharging the flood of stress hormones, completing the arc. Once the trembling subsides, the gazelle resets. It is not doomed to panic at every rustle of the grass. Humans, however, rarely complete the arc. Our social systems intervene. A child frightened by a slammed door is told, stop overreacting. A teenager betrayed by friends is ridiculed for being too sensitive. An adult who suffers assault or humiliation is pressured to move on. In each case, the body's natural attempt to shake, cry, rage, or flee is blocked. The nervous system is left holding unfinished energy. That energy does not dissolve, it waits. It embeds itself in muscle, in breath, in posture, in unconscious reflex. This is the seed of the trauma loop. Step by step, how a loop forms. Let's break down what happens physiologically when a child encounters overwhelming stress but is not allowed to complete the response. 1. Trigger. The child hears shouting, feels shame, or perceives rejection. The amygdala, the brain's smoke alarm, sounds. Adrenaline and cortisol surge. The heart rate accelerates. Blood flows to the limbs. The body enters survival mode. 2. Mobilization. The body prepares to act. Tears well. Muscles tense to run or fight. Breath quickens. The urge to cry out, to move, to defend emerges. 3. Interruption. The adult intervenes. Don't cry. Sit down. Don't answer back. Or worse, punishment follows. Scolding, isolation, even physical reprimand. The survival response is blocked. 4. Suppression. The energy has no outlet. Tears are swallowed. Anger is clenched in the jaw. Muscles remain taut without discharge. The breath remains shallow. 5. Encoding. The hippocampus, which normally timestamps memory as past, fails under cortisol overload. The amygdala, by contrast, stores the intensity. The event becomes timeless, ready to resurface. 6. Loop formation. Later, similar cues reignite the same cascade. A raised voice, a dismissive tone, a sudden loud sound. The body reacts as though the original danger is happening again. The arc is unfinished, so it repeats. This is why people say trauma is not what happened, but what happens inside. The unfinished arc is carried forward. Polyvagal theory. Why completion matters. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory helps illuminate this. The vagus nerve has 2 primary branches, the ventral vagus, which anchors social connection and calm, and the dorsal vagus, which governs shutdown and freeze. In a healthy cycle, stress mobilizes sympathetic arousal, fight, flight. Then resolution brings the system back to ventral vagal safety. But when an interruption occurs, the system collapses into dorsal shutdown or becomes stuck in sympathetic overdrive. The return to safety never happens. Instead, the nervous system hovers between hyperarousal and collapse. This is the physiological architecture of a loop, childhood conditioning, and the policing of emotion. Why does this interruption happen so often? Because our cultures reward suppression. In many families, a crying child is scolded. In schools, trembling or freezing is punished. Boys are told not to cry, girls not to be dramatic. Anger is labelled as defiance, tears as weakness, and silence as disrespect. These cultural codes are not neutral. They train children to distrust their own signals. What is silenced does not vanish. A child told not to cry will still carry the tears in their nervous system. A teenager punished for anger will still carry the rage in their muscles. A young adult shamed for fear will still carry hypervigilance in their amygdala. These are not erased, they are encoded. Suppression becomes the soil in which loops grow. The shame spiral. One of the cruelest consequences of unfinished arcs is shame. Imagine someone who panics in a supermarket or freezes in a meeting. To outsiders, it looks irrational. To themselves, it feels humiliating. Why can't I handle this? They ask. Shame compounds stress, reinforcing the loop. The loop itself becomes a source of further trauma. This is a cycle I've known myself. Times when I shut down mid-conversation or when anger flared out of nowhere. At the time, I blamed myself. I thought it was a flaw of character. Only later did I understand my nervous system was replaying unfinished cycles. It wasn't that I lacked control. It was that control had been demanded of me too often, too early, and my body had never finished what it needed to finish. Why survival trumps happiness? From an evolutionary standpoint, the body doesn't prioritize happiness. It prioritizes predictability. The nervous system prefers familiar pain to uncertain safety. If freezing once avoided punishment, freezing becomes encoded as safer than fight or flight. In adulthood, this re-emerges as chronic shutdown, even when it costs connection and authenticity. This is why survivors of abuse sometimes return to abusive partners. Why do people raised in chaos often recreate chaos? Why silence feels safer than honesty? The body is not betraying you. It is repeating what once kept you alive. Philosophical reflections. Trauma as unfinished time. Philosophers have wrestled with the nature of time for centuries, and trauma adds its own dimension. Augustine described the present as a bridge between memory and expectation. Trauma shatters that bridge. The past floods the present, while the future collapses into a narrow band of survival. Nietzsche's eternal return becomes literal in the nervous system. The same patterns replay endlessly, not as metaphor but as biology. In Buddhist thought, samsara is the wheel of endless repetition, suffering that loops until awareness breaks the cycle. Trauma is samsara embodied. Without completion, the nervous system keeps turning the wheel. Jung called these patterns complexes, clusters of memory, emotion, and reflex that hijack the self whenever triggered. The modern term is trauma loop, but the ancient insight is the same. What is unfinished repeats. Case studies. Science of the Unfinished. Judith Herman in Trauma and Recovery describes how survivors of captivity or abuse relive helplessness because their bodies never completed escape. What looks like weakness is survival frozen in time. Bessel van der Kolk, in The Body Keeps the Score, documents veterans whose bodies still flinched at car backfires decades after war. Their startle reflex was an arc unfinished. Peter Levine, in Waking the Tiger, observed that trauma is not about the lion's attack, but the body's inability to shake it off afterwards. The incomplete trembling becomes the loop. Each case points to the same truth. Trauma is unfinished biology. Embodied signs of unfinished arcs. You don't need a lab to recognize loops. They show up in the body every day. tremors that never resolve into calm, stomach knots that appear during conflict, throats that constrict whenever truth wants to be spoken, headaches after emotional suppression, sleepless nights after silenced arguments. These are not random. They are the unfinished arcs of the nervous system, whispering reminders of what has not been resolved. Personal reflection, I felt this across my own life. As a child, I would become overwhelmed by demands and expectations until my body couldn't hold them anymore. Sometimes I froze silent and still. Other times, the pressure erupted in meltdowns, anger that seemed to come from nowhere. Adults saw irritability, defiance, what was perceived as attitude, frustration, anger, and bad behavior. What they didn't see was suppression. Each outburst was the aftershock of too many unfinished arcs. Later in life, I sought a diagnosis: bipolar type 2, autism, and ADHD. On one level, the labels made sense. They explained why I felt different, why I struggled in ways others didn't. But on another level, I came to see them as part of a system that pathologizes human survival. My loops were not diseases. They were the echoes of unfinished arcs, amplified by environments that punished rather than soothed. I learned that waiting for others to validate my experience only deepened the loop. The real shift came when I validated myself, when I named the loop not as failure but as survival. That reframing didn't erase the pain, but it softened the shame. Reflection prompts. Where in your life were you silenced when your body wanted to cry, shout, or tremble? Do you notice places where calm feels unsafe or kindness feels suspicious? Can you trace patterns of repetition, panic, shutdown, and anger back to unfinished arcs in childhood? Trauma does not complete itself because we were interrupted, but interruption is not destiny. Awareness allows us to pick up where the cycle was cut short. Naming the unfinished arc is the first act of compassion, the first crack where light enters the loop. The physiology of repetition. When we describe trauma loops, it can sound abstract, like a psychological metaphor, a poetic way of talking about memory. But trauma loops are not simply ideas, they are physiology. They live in the body's chemistry, in its neural wiring, in the reflexes that fire before conscious thought has a chance to intervene. Trauma repetition is not just mental, it is embodied at every level. To understand this, we have to look closely at the body's operating system. The nervous system is designed with one priority: survival. Not happiness, not fulfillment, not authenticity, survival. When danger is perceived, whether real or remembered, the body prioritizes predictable responses. And that preference for predictability is what anchors loops. The nervous system will return to the same strategies over and over, even when they harm us, simply because it has proven them survivable. The amygdala and alarm. At the center of this system sits the amygdala, two almond-shaped structures deep in the brain. The amygdala functions like a smoke alarm, scanning constantly for cues of danger. Once triggered, it sets off the cascade of stress responses: adrenaline surges, cortisol floods, and blood is rerouted to muscles. This all unfolds within milliseconds, far quicker than conscious thought. By the time you notice your racing heart or clenched fists, the amygdala has already pulled the lever. In trauma loops, the amygdala becomes hypersensitized. It fires alarms even when no fire burns. A door slam, a raised eyebrow, a sudden silence, these become coded as threats because once, long ago, they were. The amygdala doesn't distinguish past from present. Its priority is survival at all costs, even if it means false alarms. And every false alarm strengthens the loop, training the body to anticipate threat everywhere. The hippocampus and collapsed time. Normally, the hippocampus helps us distinguish past from present. It tags experiences with timestamps, ensuring we know the difference between memory and current reality. But under chronic stress, cortisol impairs the hippocampus. Traumatic memories are left unfiled, timeless. This is why trauma feels as though it is happening again, not just remembered. Imagine hearing a sudden raised voice that echoes a parent's rage from decades ago. The hippocampus should step in and say, "That was then, this is now." But in trauma loops, that function falters. Instead, the body collapses time. The present moment fuses with the past. The adult in the room becomes indistinguishable from the parent in memory. Rationally, you know they're different. Physiologically, your body cannot tell. The prefrontal cortex in the offline state, then there is the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought, planning, and reflection. In calm states, it helps us regulate emotion, evaluate options, and choose how to respond. But when cortisol and adrenaline surge, the prefrontal cortex goes offline. The body reverts to reflex. This is why loops feel involuntary. In the moment, choice is unavailable. By the time you tell yourself, "I won't react like that again," the body has already done it. The triad of amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex explains the physiology of repetition. Alarms hypersensitized, time collapsed, reason offline. The loop is not a weakness, it is neurobiology. Cortisol, adrenaline, and chemical conditioning. Every loop is reinforced by chemistry. When cortisol and adrenaline flood the system, they leave chemical imprints. The body learns to expect them. Neural pathways strengthen with repetition. What fires together wires together. This is heavy learning at the level of stress. Over time, the nervous system becomes conditioned to anticipate stress hormones, just as an addict's body craves its next fix. This is why survivors often describe living on edge, unable to relax even when nothing is wrong. Their bodies are not malfunctioning. They are adapted to anticipate the next hit. Safety feels unfamiliar, even suspicious, while hypervigilance feels like home. Repetition compulsion. Freud to neuroscience Freud once described what he called repetition compulsion, the puzzling tendency of trauma survivors to reenact their suffering. Soldiers returning to the battlefield, victims of abuse seeking similar partners, people repeating patterns they swore they'd avoid. Freud saw this as a mystery of the unconscious. Modern neuroscience reframes it as physiology. The nervous system prefers what is known. Even when the known is painful, it is survivable. An abused child who learned to freeze may repeat freezing in adulthood, not because it feels good, but because it once kept them alive. The compulsion is not masochism. It is survival logic. I know this script. I survived it before. I can survive it again. This is one of the cruelest ironies of trauma. What once protected becomes the very thing that imprisons. Loops as comfort, familiarity over freedom. I've known this in my own life. Patterns I swore I would never repeat somehow resurfaced. Relationships that mirrored old dynamics, silences that echoed childhood shutdowns, anger that erupted from nowhere. At first I thought I was weak, doomed to repeat mistakes. Later I understood my nervous system wasn't betraying me. It was trying to protect me, choosing the devil it knew over the uncertainty of change. That's the paradox of trauma loops. They feel safer than freedom. Safety, when unfamiliar, feels dangerous. Calm feels alien. Joy feels fleeting. Kindness can feel suspicious. This is why trauma recovery is not just about choosing better. It is about retraining the nervous system to tolerate safety, to expand what feels survivable. Epigenetic echoes repetition doesn't stop with one lifetime. Epigenetics shows that trauma alters gene expression, leaving chemical marks that shape how future generations respond to stress. Holocaust survivors' descendants show altered cortisol regulation. Children of famine survivors carry metabolic patterns, predisposing them to scarcity even in abundance. Trauma loops echo down bloodlines, carried not only through stories and parenting styles, but in biology itself. This is why entire communities can inherit nervous system states. Colonization, war, and slavery leave imprints that ripple through generations. A child born today may carry stress responses shaped by the terrors of ancestors. Loops are not just personal, they are collective. Everyday scenarios of loops. To ground this, let's map a few everyday scenarios. The slammed door. A person jumps at the sound, heart racing. Logically, they know it's the wind, but their body insists, danger, the loop replays. The dismissive smirk. A colleague rolls their eyes in a meeting. Suddenly, your chest tightens, words vanish. You're no longer in the office. You're back in the classroom where teachers mocked mistakes. The cutting joke. Laughter erupts at your expense around the dinner table. You smile, but inside you freeze. Rationally, it's just a joke. Physiologically, it's ridiculous all over again. Each scenario shows the same mechanism. Present cues linked to past pain, reflexes firing before thought, time collapsing into repetition. Reflection. The illusion of choice. This is what makes trauma loops so cruel. They masquerade as choice. Outwardly, it looks like you chose to snap, to leave, to freeze. Inwardly, the loop had already fired. The amygdala pulled the lever before the prefrontal cortex even woke up. You promise yourself, next time I'll do better. But when the next time comes, the physiology repeats. This creates the shame spiral, blaming yourself for biology. But understanding the physiology breaks that illusion. It isn't a weakness. It isn't moral failure. It is the nervous system replaying what it never finished. Practices for mapping your own repetition. One of the most powerful tools is simply to notice. Map your loops. Write down what triggered the response. What sensations rose in the body? What thoughts followed? What action or shutdown occurred? Over time, patterns emerge. The same stomach knot, the same shallow breath, the same tight jaw. These are the footprints of loops. Naming them weakens their hold. Awareness creates a pause, however small, in which new choices can grow. Personal reflection. In my own journey, I came to see how much of my life was guided by repetition. Times when I walked into a group and instantly felt on edge. Not because of anything happening in the moment, but because my body was already anticipating betrayal. Times when anger boiled at a minor slight, but the real heat came from decades earlier. Times when silence seemed like the only option, echoing the old conditioning that speaking was dangerous. I used to see these as flaws. Now I see them as unfinished arcs. My body wasn't broken. It was trying again and again to finish what it never could, to be heard, to be safe, to rest. The physiology of repetition shows us why loops are so stubborn. They are not habits you can break by willpower alone. They are embodied scripts reinforced by chemistry, wiring, and even inheritance. They repeat not because you're weak, but because the body is faithful to survival. But the fact that they are written does not mean they cannot be rewritten. Neural plasticity is real. Just as trauma carved these grooves, healing can etch new ones. The body that repeats can also relearn. Chemical loops, the nervous system under siege by food and drugs. When most of us hear the phrase trauma loops, we think about memory. Flashbacks triggers panic in ordinary situations. But repetition doesn't only live in the psyche, it also lives in what we put into our bodies. The nervous system can be trained, manipulated, and even hijacked not just by experience, but by chemicals, the everyday substances we consume that subtly reinforce cycles of dependence, stress, and disconnection. This is not a discovery. Systems of control have always known that altering what goes into the body is one of the fastest ways to alter perception. Cults lace wine, leaders distribute sacred substances, and ritual intoxicants are often used not just for transcendence, but for weakening resistance. Drugs, alcohol, and sugar blur boundaries, soften awareness, and make people easier to manipulate. But here's the harder truth. What cults do in small rooms, societies do at scale. We may not be handed a chalice by a charismatic leader, but we are handed brightly coloured cans by corporations. Instead of chanting rituals, we have advertising jingles. Instead of being pressured by a small group, we are pressured by culture itself. And the effect is similar. Nervous systems dulled, confused, kept spinning in loops. Trauma loops meet chemical loops. The connection between trauma and substances runs deep. Survivors of trauma often develop heightened stress physiology. Cortisol surges, amygdala alarms, dopamine dips. In that state, chemicals that promise relief, alcohol, sugar, stimulants, even processed foods, land with extra force. They soothe briefly. They distract temporarily. They alter perception just enough to make life tolerable. But because the relief is fleeting, the cycle repeats. This is why so many trauma survivors struggle with addiction or dependency. The substance doesn't create the loop. It attaches itself to the loop already there. Trauma creates unfinished stress responses. Chemicals offer temporary discharge. The body learns. Cue to stress leads to substance, substance leads to momentary relief, and then a crash, which leads into a cycle of repeat. It is the same unfinished arc replayed through molecules. Historical parallels, sugar, alcohol, and empire history shows us that chemical loops have long been tools of control. Colonial powers didn't just conquer with weapons, they conquered with sugar and alcohol. Sugar plantations not only enriched empires but also addicted populations to sweetness. Alcohol was used to pacify communities, dulling resistance and fracturing collective strength. Even in modern politics, substances have been strategically deployed. During apartheid in South Africa, cheap alcohol was promoted in black communities as a form of pacification. In indigenous communities across the world, colonizers introduced high-strength alcohol that devastated traditional ways of life. These were not random accidents. They were deliberate strategies of disempowerment. When we look at the present supermarket aisles lined with sugar, caffeine, and artificial additives, we should remember this history. Chemical loops are not just personal quirks. They are systemic strategies, consciously or unconsciously maintained, to keep populations distracted, docile, and divided. Cult parallels. To see this clearly, let's return briefly to the cult example. In manipulative groups, intoxicants are rarely accidental. Alcohol is offered to dull awareness. Psychoactive substances are framed as spiritual tools, but are used to imprint new beliefs. Sexual rituals confuse intimacy with exploitation. Each of these interventions creates chemical loops, high crash dependence, and each loop reinforces psychological control. Society's versions are less obvious but no less powerful. The sacred drink is now a branded soft drink. The ritual chant is now a jingle. The group pressure is now a cultural norm. And at the center of many of these loops is one of the most widely consumed and underestimated substances of all, artificial sweeteners. The modern Kool-Aid people joke about drinking the Kool-Aid. They forget that this phrase comes from tragedy. The Jonestown Massacre, where hundreds of people died after drinking cyanide-laced sugary drink. But here's the twist. Today's soft drinks are their own kind of Kool-Aid. They may not contain cyanide, but they contain substances that dull awareness, confuse the nervous system, and create cycles of dependency. Aspartame is one of the most infamous. Marketed as a harmless sugar alternative, it's present in thousands of products, from diet sodas to chewing gum to protein bars. It promises sweetness without calories, pleasure without guilt. But what does it actually do to the body? Here is the preserved analysis you've already drafted, expanded only by context, track time analysis. What happens when you drink aspartame minute 0, 1? Anticipation and ritual. The sound of the can opening, the fizz of carbonation, and the scent of artificial fruit prime the brain. Dopamine release begins before you even drink. As Berridge and Robinson's work on incentive sensitization shows, the wanting system can be triggered by cues alone, independent of the reward itself. Robinson and Berridge, 2016, Addiction. Already, your body is hooked into a loop of expectation. Minutes 1, 5. Sweetness without substance. Aspartame interacts with sweet receptors on the tongue, tricking the body into expecting sugar. Normally, sweetness signals calories and glucose. Here, the body is deceived. Insulin release can still be triggered in anticipation. A 2013 study in diabetes care found that artificial sweeteners can prime the cephalic phase insulin response. Brown et al., 2013. This mismatch begins a subtle stress loop. The body prepares for energy that never arrives. Minutes 5:15. Neurochemical processing. Aspartame breaks down into phenylalanine, aspartic acid, and methanol. High phenylalanine levels can cross the blood-brain barrier, interfering with neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. Humphreys et al., European Journal of Clinical Nutrition, 2008. Methanol metabolizes into formaldehyde in small amounts which the body can normally process, but chronic exposure may build subtle neurotoxicity. These shifts manifest as slight changes in mood, focus, and energy regulation. Minutes 15:30. Nervous system response. The dopamine hit of sweetness fades quickly. Unlike real sugar, there is no caloric reinforcement. Studies show artificial sweeteners may blunt the brain's reward response over time, leading to increased cravings and altered appetite regulation. Swithers, 2013. Trends in endocrinology and metabolism. The vagus nerve linking gut and brain receives confused signals, sweetness without satiety. Minutes 30, 120, the after effects. For some, this is where headaches, brain fog, or mood shifts begin. A double-blind study, Lipton et al., 1989, linked aspartame consumption to higher reports of headaches. Animal studies suggest long-term aspartame exposure may affect memory and oxidative stress in brain tissue. Iswami and Rathinasamy, 2012. While industry-funded studies often downplay risks, the pattern is clear: subtle nervous system imbalance. Hours later, repetition and craving. The loop repeats: anticipation, deception, disappointment. The body never receives the glucose it expects. Cravings increase. The consumer reaches for another can. The trauma loop of unfinished survival is mirrored by the chemical loop of unfinished satisfaction. Loops within loops. This is where the connection becomes undeniable. Trauma loops are unfinished stress responses. Chemical loops are unfinished reward responses. Both operate through the same nervous system circuits: dopamine highs, cortisol crashes, vagal dysregulation. A trauma survivor, already primed for hypervigilance, is especially vulnerable to these loops. The nervous system, desperate for relief, latches onto whatever brings momentary ease. But the substance rarely delivers. Instead, it deepens the loop. Stress leads to chemical, chemical leads to relief, and then the crash, which creates more stress. In this way, aspartame and similar additives don't just harm metabolism. They keep people locked in survival states, unable to fully access clarity, unable to fully trust their own bodies. Historical echoes: this is not new. Sugar was once so valuable that it was called white gold. Its addictive pull fueling empires. Alcohol devastated indigenous populations, fracturing traditions and weakening resistance. Today's soft drinks and processed foods are part of that lineage. They pacify, distract, and keep people looping and craving. Think of it as an empire by other means. Colonizers once distributed rum. Now corporations distribute cans. Both weaken awareness. Both create dependency. Both reinforce control. Personal reflection: I've noticed it in my own awareness. When I'm clear, connected to my body, I can pick up subtle shifts in people's behavior. I can sense distance, tension, even dishonesty. But I've also observed people dulled by chemical inputs. It's not intelligence, it's clarity. If your nervous system is constantly confused by substances, your intuition suffers. You stop hearing the whispers of the body. That's the real danger. Chemical loops don't just harm health. They disconnect people from themselves. And when you can't hear your own body, you're easier to control. Signs to watch. Here are some questions for reflection. Do you notice cravings for sweet drinks even when you're not hungry? Do you experience brain fog, headaches, or mood dips after consuming them? Do you see yourself reaching for the can, not out of desire, but because it feels inevitable? These are not quirks, they are loops. And like trauma loops, they can be recognized, named, and interrupted. Chemical loops show us that trauma is not only psychological, it is reinforced at the level of molecules. Aspartame, sugar, alcohol, processed foods, these are not neutral. They hijack the nervous system's survival and reward circuits, keeping people locked in cycles that mirror trauma itself. And recognizing this does not mean living in fear of every sip. It means reclaiming awareness. It means seeing loops where before there was only habit. Once you see, you can choose differently. Because the nervous system that repeats can also relearn. The loop is not destiny. Loops are not weakness. They are survival. As we close this episode, I want to return to the central truth that has echoed through every example, every analysis, and every reflection we've explored. Trauma loops are not signs of weakness. They are survival strategies. They are the nervous system's way of saying, I haven't finished something important. I am still holding on because I still need to protect you. That's what makes loops so painful. They aren't about choice. They aren't about morals. They aren't about being broken. They are about unfinished survival stories, the body's attempt to complete what it never could in the past. The supermarket panic, the workplace silence, the dinner table freeze, none of these reactions are accidents. They are echoes. They are the body reliving moments where the danger was too much and resolution never came. And when you recognize that, compassion can replace shame. Shame says, "What's wrong with me?" Compassion says, "Of course I feel this. My body is still trying to protect me." That shift, subtle as it seems, is the doorway out of endless repetition. The illusion of choice. One of the cruelest aspects of loops is the illusion of choice. From the outside, it looks like you decided to freeze or overreact or shut down. To others, it might appear you walked away in anger or failed to speak up because you didn't care enough. But what they don't see is that by the time the loop activates, the choice has already been made, not by your conscious mind, but by your body's survival system. The amygdala has already fired, the vagus nerve has already shifted, and cortisol and adrenaline are already flooding the bloodstream. The story is already being written before your conscious awareness even catches up. That's why willpower rarely works against loops. You cannot simply decide to stop them, because they are not starting in the part of the brain where decisions live. They are starting in the body, in reflexes honed over years, even generations. The hope is this. Once you recognize that loops are not about failing to choose well, but about being stuck in preconscious survival patterns, you can begin to loosen the grip of shame. You can see yourself not as broken, but as repeating. And once you name the repetition, you open the possibility of something new. A scenario of realization. I want to bring this down into a moment many people might recognize. Imagine someone in a relationship who notices that every disagreement with their partner seems to spiral into the same pattern. It starts small, maybe a sigh, maybe a sarcastic comment. Suddenly, the chest tightens, the voice raises, or maybe it goes silent altogether. The same argument plays out again and again, even if the topic is different. Later, this person thinks, "Why do I always react this way? Why can't I just stay calm?" The shame sets in. But when they begin to look at it through the lens of loops, they realize something crucial. The argument isn't really about the sigh or the sarcastic comment. It's about echoes of dismissal in childhood, echoes of not being heard, echoes of danger when voices got sharp or moods turned cold. The partner may think they're just being grumpy, but the body reads it as, "Here we go again, the old threat is back." The loop fires, recognizing that changes everything. Suddenly, the focus shifts from "I'm broken" to "My body is remembering." And from there, a new possibility emerges. Instead of drowning in shame or defensiveness, the person can pause and ask, "What is my body telling me? What unfinished story is being replayed here?" That small act of recognition can begin to soften the loop. Compassion over shame. This is why compassion matters more than analysis alone. We can map the amygdala, trace cortisol's effects, and name the pathways of the vagus nerve. All of that is valuable. But knowledge without compassion can become another weapon of shame. It can leave you thinking, "I know the science, so why can't I stop?" Compassion interrupts that spiral. Compassion says, "You are not failing. You are carrying something unfinished." And carrying unfinished survival is not a weakness, it is a testament to your endurance. For me personally, this has been one of the hardest lessons. I used to believe that if I just explained myself better, if I could just make people understand, then the loops would end. But over time, I learned that the real shift came when I stopped demanding understanding from others and started offering it to myself. Self validation became the first act of freedom. Instead of saying "I'm broken," I could say "I survived." Instead of saying "I always overreact," I could say "My body remembers, and that's okay." That self recognition, fragile at first, built a foundation where healing could begin. Signposts for awareness. I want to leave you with a few subtle signposts, not as rigid practices, but as invitations. Notice the first sensation that signals a loop beginning. Is it a tightening in the chest, a clench in the jaw, a heat rising in the face? That moment, small as it is where awareness begins. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" try asking, "When have I felt this before?" Often, the body's present reaction is linked to a past echo. Try journaling not just events, but body states. Write down what your body felt, not only what happened. Over time, you may see patterns that words alone don't reveal. These small shifts help teach the body a new story, that noticing is not dangerous, that awareness is not the same as being trapped. Loops in the collective. It's not only individuals who loop. Entire cultures do. We see it in politics, in communities, even in nations. Old wounds resurface, old divisions replay, old fears find new targets. The collective nervous system, like the personal one, often struggles to complete what was left unfinished. Wars repeat themes of older wars. Economic collapses echo past crises. Cultural conflicts resurface in new forms, but with the same underlying tensions. These are collective trauma loops, societies reliving what they have not resolved. This perspective matters because it reminds us, when you notice your own loops, you are not alone. You are part of a larger pattern. And just as individuals can learn new ways of responding, So too can cultures, though it takes time and awareness. A personal reflection. When I think back on my own journey, I see loops everywhere. Times when I repeated patterns in relationships, times when I mistook silence for safety, times when I reacted not to the person in front of me, but to ghosts from the past. At first, I thought the answer was to work harder, explain better, or control more tightly. But the more I tried, the more the loops tightened. What shifted was not effort, but compassion. I began to see that I wasn't failing, I was reliving. And once I saw that, I could begin to step outside of it. I still encounter loops. They don't vanish overnight. But now I can meet them with more gentleness. I can notice the tight chest and say, I know you. You're trying to protect me. I can pause before the spiral takes over. And in that pause, I can breathe, I can choose differently, I can remember that now is not then. A hint of other perspectives. While this episode has been grounded in psychology and physiology, I want to gesture briefly towards something broader. Many spiritual traditions speak of cycles, of repeating until lessons are learned. Buddhism calls it samsara, the wheel of suffering. Nietzsche spoke of eternal return. Jung described complexes as autonomous patterns that repeat until integrated. Whether or not you frame it spiritually, the echo is the same. We repeat what we cannot resolve. Loops are both psychological and existential, and healing in any language means finding ways to step out of blind repetition and into conscious choice. This brings us to where we're heading. If trauma loops are about unfinished survival energy that repeats, then dissociation is what happens when the body decides that even repetition is too much. When the loop overwhelms, sometimes the only option left is to check out, to go still, to disappear inside. That's where we're going in the next episode. Dissociation as survival. We'll explore why the body sometimes chooses not to fight, not to flee, but to leave altogether. We'll look at depersonalization, derealization, and the quiet cost of masking. And we'll ground it in real scenarios, the arguments where you space out, the conflicts where words vanish, the moments where you're present in body but absent in self. Because if loops teach us how the past keeps intruding into the present, dissociation shows us what happens when even the present becomes unbearable. Thank you for being here, for walking with me through this exploration of trauma loops, not as abstract theories, but as lived realities, as nervous system echoes, as stories waiting to be completed. I hope that this episode has offered not just insight, but compassion for yourself, for those you love, and for the parts of you that still carry unfinished survival stories. In our next episode, we'll turn to dissociation, that strange, silent form of survival that costs authenticity but protects life. Until then, you've been listening to The Body Knows. Take care of yourself, listen to your body, and remember that every loop is a chance for awareness, not condemnation. James Miller.